the Deputy Director at the Asian American Federation. Many of you know us because you are our member and partner organizations. For those of you who don't, we are a leadership organization that works to address the most urgent needs of the Pan-Asian community. And we do that through research, through advocacy, special initiatives, and obviously nonprofit support of our 70 member and partner groups. So with me today is our Ahmed Budd, who's our civic engagement coordinator, who's providing tech support. Thank you, Ahmed. And Howard Shi, our research and policy director, who will be moderating the Q&A, the later portion of this. We'll spend about an hour on just for our presenters, and then also give you an opportunity to ask some questions. So without further ado, I want to introduce our presenters. John Albert, he's a partner at Bolton St. John's, which is a government relations and public affairs firm that represents interests throughout New York State. And Louisa Hackett, she is the founder and director of Community Votes. Some of you may know her and your work. And Community Votes helps nonprofits increase their capacity to implement innovative nonpartisan voter outreach programs, which many of you are also involved in. So thanks for joining us, and I am going to hand it over to John.
Hi, everyone. First, Juhan, thank you for having me, and thanks to the Federation for all that you do. We can go to the next slide. You don't have to announce my firm. Just, before we get started, just 2 seconds about me. One, I was very moved by what happened yesterday in front of, it was at 360 West 43rd Street. It was very troubling. And, one of the most troubling parts for me was that people didn't come and help. And one of the things that I know working with, people like you, all of the communities that serve others, is that I know for a fact every single person on this call would have stepped in. And I know that. And that's what gives me hope about, our future as a city. So I want to thank you for all that you do. And I know that we'll get through this. So we can just 2 seconds about me. I'm at a firm called Bolton St. John's, but my start actually was with an organization called Victim Services. And so I'm so glad to see Saki on the, represented here. I got my start as a Saki volunteer. So, I did a lot of domestic violence and sexual assault work. And then I moved to a place called the After School Corporation doing youth development work. And so I have a broad background in nonprofit delivery, and then then my career took a turn. I worked for the city, and then now at this firm. So I just wanted to give you that context because I've been, for the vast majority of my career, actually have been in the nonprofit and government world, and so I know some of the challenges that you go through every day. So we'll just jump right into it. The next slide. Our discussion is really about what, as a 501c3, and I'm going to assume all of us on this call and on this meeting are 501c3 organizations, but really what can we do when we're faced with a year like this, right? This is an election year, and we need to really understand the context of what's going on. The reason this year is really different from others, one, is because we have, in the city, we have a citywide election. We also have so many races, right? And I think that's really, it's really something that we have to kind of absorb. I think 36 or 37 of the city council members are flipping over, and then more so because many people are just leaving early, right? So there's a lot of churn. That coupled with ranked choice voting, plus an increase in campaign matching funds, means there's tons of people running, and it just means there's just a lot more that nonprofits have to pay attention to, right? And so that's the context for this. And so I just want to begin by letting you know, and I think you already know this, it's like what you can't do. In the first part of this training that we did a couple of months ago, we talked about the lobbying, the cans, and what you can't do. Now this is the kind of the political intervention. When you see my slides, and I'm just not going to read through all of them because I think if you need for them for reference, I'm sure they'll be shared with you. What I've done is I've asked a series of questions on the left, And most of the words on the right, I have cut and pasted from the IRS circulars that went along to answer these questions. And so this is actual language that the IRS uses. And that's why I think it's important that we kind of absorb what these, what the words are. And hopefully I can walk you through this, give you a better understanding. So we all know that 501c3 nonprofits can't do certain things, right? But they are absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly participating or intervening in political campaigns. And I think that's a great place to start, because you have to understand that is where the government starts, right? So participating and intervening is, and we'll kind of unpack these words, we'll figure out what, but you don't want to get involved as a 501c3, and the consequences are pretty harsh. Not only would the New York Post write a story about you, right, which is embarrassing enough, but there are other consequences, including fines and loss of status, right? And so we'll just jump to the next slide. So what does participating and intervening look like to us, right? So it looks like, or to them, when somebody in the nonprofit world does this, it looks like contributions to political campaigns or public statements of position, right? So this can be both verbal and written, but it's coming from the nonprofit in support or opposition of a candidate. And we just have to be mindful of what that really means, and how people are going to perceive some of the action that you're taking. I feel like as a nonprofit, you just want to engage at everybody at every level. And you just need to know when there's a red light and when there's a yellow light and when there's a green light. So just remember, as a blanket, public statements and contributions are what's going to trigger some of this analysis. So next slide. So think about contributions, right? So if you're a nonprofit in its using its own checking account or transfer or electronic transfer, you're already off to a bad start. So I don't know any nonprofit that does this, but if you're making contributions, I just want you to know that, it's absolutely forbidden, right? There are actually, what I wanted to point out was that the IRS rules, as I mentioned, apply, but moreover, the campaign finance rules apply, because in the city of New York, you can only donate individual funds, right, for the campaign matching program. So there's no way you're going to get away with anybody writing a corporate check in the city of New York, whether it's the IRS or based on New York City's campaign finance. So you have to get this out of your mind right away. There are some instances, and I know how campaigns approach people, and we'll talk about those later, but these are just the basic rules for us. So next slide. So what's the worst that can happen? They will take away your tax exempt status. You will likely, you will be out of business, and the worst of it is you will be hampering the good work that you've already done. You lose credibility, and everybody associated with the organization will likely, lose credibility. So you don't want to get into this. The next slide. So I'm just going to do, just a little plug for Louisa's part that's coming up, because you're, like, John, you're so negative. You're telling us all the stuff we can't do, but what can we do? So Louisa's going to talk about this stuff: voter education, voter guides, candidate forums, all the stuff that we can engage in and to empower our communities and move an agenda forward. But I just wanted to, throw this out there. It just has to be done in a nonpartisan manner, and it has to it has to fit in, and Louisa's going to jump into this after I'm done with my portion. So next slide. So there's an exception to the exception, right? So the general rule is you can't do it. Louisa's going to tell you all the stuff you can do, but it has to be in a neutral way. So that's what I mean by the exception to the exception. So whether you're doing a voter education drive, registration activities, anything else, it just can't be biased towards one candidate or another candidate. Next slide. So again, I just want to jump into the the things that we're faced with, right, as nonprofits. One is make or solicit contributions. This is where it gets tricky. Everybody knows that your official checkbook can't write a check, but it starts getting into gray areas when we start talking about soliciting contributions, right? Because many of our executive directors and even ourselves in these organizations have either personal connection to candidates, right? If you are doing good work in the city of New York, you have run into Scott Stringer before. You have run into Eric Adams before. You've run into these folks in these various circles, and they put pressure on you, right? Friendly pressure, other pressure to, because of that prior relationship, to help solicit contributions. But just remember, your organization cannot solicit contributions, right? Because it really is a form of endorsement, right? The second thing is you can't rate candidates. And that's no matter how objective the ratings may be. And there, and I think Louise is going to get into some of this, but you have to present them in a neutral way. So soliciting contributions, rating candidates, right? I think the other stuff you guys know, you can't distribute partisan campaign literature. One of the things that I find that happens a lot, and is something to be mindful of, is the various relationships that any nonprofit has with people who are running for office. One of my clients, very large nonprofit, they have so many programs that it's like they'll discover every month or so somebody else running for office for the city council. There are about 10 candidates for office for every city council race. And somebody comes out of the woodwork and like, oh, that person worked for us a year ago, 5 years ago. So one of the things that, and we'll talk about this, is the way to mitigate that. But what you don't want is those folks using your networks, your nonprofit networks, under your banner, handing out their literature, whether it's electronically or otherwise. And so I think you get a good picture of what it means, what you can't do, right? So we can just jump onto the next slide. So the other question people ask is, do I have to just stop everything I do, right? And during election season? And the answer is no, right? Because we are advocating for things, and that is part of the mission. And if you're issue-based advocacy organization, providing services on the one hand and advocacy on the other, you can continue to do so. And I think it's actually very smart to continue to do so. So that way, no one can ever say, well, it's very strange that you stopped doing this because candidate X you like, and they're opposed to this, or something. I just think it's good practice to keep doing what you're doing and continue to do it year round. And I think that's just good advocacy, right? So you're not actually following the campaign calendar for anything. You're actually following maybe the legislative calendar to do your advocacy. Just make sure whatever you're doing is just, if it's ongoing series of communications, keep doing it the same way, right? And so I think that would really help clarify things. And it's the final bullet is really about the way that the legislative calendar is laid out. And I think just if, again, as you know, in Albany, the state budget is going to be passed soon, knock on wood. And what we want to be mindful of is, if you were doing things in end of March, continue to do that. So I think that's a good way of showing that it's business as usual from your end. Next slide. So one of the things that comes up often is and how do you talk about this, some of the candidates, right? So part of voter education allows you, right, to lay out to your constituents and the people that you serve who the candidates are. So as long as you're talking about every candidate, you can actually link on your website to, as part of a voter education campaign, as long as it's unbiased and you're as neutral as possible. Because people do think, oh, I can't even talk about elections, But there are ways to do this, and I'm sure Louise is going to jump into it. But I just want to mention that website stuff is okay. It just has to be couched in some of this in this language. Next slide. So another hot topic beyond is your gala. Usually, in other years, around this time is when most nonprofits are planning their spring fundraising, and it just gets really sticky. And because election season and gala season always overlap, right? So whether, and I know because of COVID, a lot of this activity has been really curtailed, but it's just something that you have to be mindful of, right? So there are a couple of things. One is you can invite people, right, to come to your gala, as long as your gala is not just a substitute for one of their campaign events. You just have to make sure there's a nonpartisan atmosphere. You have to make sure that whoever the person is not talking about their campaign. If they're being honored, right, you talk about their other position. So for example, when one of my clients, they had a long-standing relationship with Ray McGuire. And in the fall, they were planning on a fundraiser for themselves, where he was the speaker. And so everything that mentioned him mentioned his relationship to Citigroup and not his campaign. That was kind of in its nascent stages at that point. So you just have to be mindful to be as thoughtful about how you characterize that person, not as a candidate, but in their other life. So again, they are welcome to come to your gala. They're welcome to speak to your gala. You just have to make sure that you identify them in everything but their position, or in their what they're running for. So next slide. So again, candidate appearances. It's very interesting because candidates call all the time. I know this happens, and says, "Hey, I see you're doing this. Can I come?" Right? Now, a couple of things about this, and one, it really depends on who's doing the asking, right? So if you have an event and you want to invite one candidate, you need to, the safest thing to do, right, is to invite everybody. And so you have to figure out a way to identify all the candidates that are viable, right, and set a very clear mark. And this is something that you can do. And what I would do is to have something in writing saying, everyone who qualifies for matching funds, or everyone who is invited to the last debate because of some other factor that some other entity has set up as why they've been invited to that debate. So if you are doing the inviting, you just need to give all qualified candidates an opportunity to speak. And what you can't do, right, is you can't invite one to a very highly attended event and invite another one to a very intentionally low-key event, right? You just need to, all the events have to be substantially similar for the speaker to get that kind of exposure. Again, no matter whether you invite them or not, you can't say that you support one over the other, right? So next slide. So I know this is a hot topic for folks, is really, okay, John, you've told us what 501c3s cannot do, but isn't there a way that we can really do this and, with a wink and a nod? And, what I say is it's really not worth it to do it under a C3, but there are ways that you can do it under another designation, but it just requires advanced planning. And so before we jump into and I see their questions popping up, and I'll definitely make sure I answer them as they and so as my slides bring up an issue, if the question is in your mind, just throw it in the chat, and we can talk about it when the questions when it's the Q&A time. So one of the things that people think is like a quick fix to everything is to just identify a to change their designation within the IRS code from a 501c3 to a C4. But it doesn't really happen as quickly as I just said, right? And there are ways and there are mechanisms that you need to take. But I just want to, draw your attention to two that you may have probably heard of, right? So there's Make the Road New York. I think we all know who they are, but they also have a 501c4 designation, and it's a separate entity called Make the Road Action. Same thing with the New York Immigration Coalition. They have a separate entity, right, called NYIC Action. Ahmed, can you just throw this link? I don't know if people can link through it into the chat, because then as I'm talking, people can maybe read through the mission of the New York Immigration Coalition Action, which is the C4. The reason I want to bring this up to you is if you get a chance to read their mission, if you could take a look at it now, they expressly connect to the C3, right? It's not as though they're pretending they're a completely different organization. What they're saying is they want the flexibility to do more. And so they've taken on this designation. And it shows that they're not hiding this connection, right? So this is the way to do it. What gets people in trouble is if you shut down the C3 and move to the C4, and it's because of technical things, because the way that you write your articles of incorporation with the state, it has to be very clear and very definite in that language, which allows the IRS to accept you in that C4 designation. But so I think you can read through that mission and you'll see that this is it's allowable. And that coordination is useful. And the next few slides, I'm going to talk to you about what are the benefits of the C4. Next slide. So for the C4, right, so who can be a C4? And it's a very narrow definition. And it's before you even start thinking about this, you need to organize you need to organize the entity at the state level when you submit your paperwork to be able to fall into one of these two categories. Whether you're a social welfare organization, right? Or your local association of employees. The second part we won't cover in this because that's mostly unions, right? So you have to be the benefit of some kind of social welfare organization. And within the state law, you have a designation as an A, B, or C corporation. And there's a direct connection between the language in either of those. And we won't get into it now, but I can follow up with you if you have specific questions on how to form a C4. But just remember, it's got to be a social welfare organization, right? Again, and organizations not organized for profit, right? So that's the most important thing here. Next slide. So what's the use, right? So why do people start C4 organizations, right? Again, I think the misperception is, oh, I can intervene directly in political campaigns. That's not exactly right, right? And so what a C4 can do may engage in some political activities, so long as it's not the primary activity, right? So if you're familiar with your 501c3 designation, it allows you to take certain elections. I don't want to go too deep into this, but within the 501c3, you can take something called the H election. The H election under 501c3 allows you to do some grassroots advocacy, to do some direct advocacy. And if you're familiar with this, you have to fill out a form, a 990 form for your 501c3. And every year they look at what percentage of your budget is for advocacy, what percentage of it is it for grassroots, and what percentage is direct, right? Those are limitations placed on C3s. C4s, right, can do more of that without going through all of that rigmarole. And that's what this is, right? Some political activity, so long as it's not the primary activity, right? So next slide. So how do you do this? I mentioned you have to fill out the right paperwork at the state first, but there's a form, right? It's a pretty straightforward form. One of the things that I found interesting, and I learned myself in preparing for this, is that you need to have, you have 60 days from when you start your activity. That's why you don't want to try and convert your C3 into a C4, because the likelihood is you would have, it's not very, the lines are fuzzy, right? Between when you start doing one activity or the other. The best thing to do is to call your organization, just like Make the Road Action, right? They didn't call themselves Make the Road New York. They call themselves something else, close enough that people wouldn't get confused. But you have to fill out this form, and you have to pay a fee. But there are penalties involved. So I just want you to be mindful of that. Next slide. So why do you want to do this, right? So a couple of things. One, and this is ongoing case law at the state, at the federal level, is you can get unlimited donations from corporations, right? Again, it signals to donors that you're doing something other than what a nonprofit is doing. So it solicits a lot of interest in terms of donations that way. Those folks, and we'll talk about this, they can't write off their donation, but it opens up a different type of donor, right? So what you'd want to do this is you can set up your organization where lobbying, right? Not political activity, lobbying is a primary activity, and which you cannot necessarily do, right, with what I talked about in the 501c3, even if you took that H election. So next slide. Okay, so what are the limitations? C4, your donations aren't deductible, right? The other thing is the 501c3, and this is a limitation, you can't have lost your C3 status and then qualify for a C4, right? So you can't have pushed the envelope. And so there are limitations on how you get to a C4 organization. And that's why I said, listen, once you start getting into these gray areas, it's better to do what NYIC Action did and Make the Road Action did, is to come up with a different entity, right? Next slide. Okay. And this is another point of confusion, because there's the arc of how we are trying to influence people, right? And it's the difference between a C4 and a PAC, because in people's minds, this is a common confusion, they believe that the C4 is a PAC versus, and it may not necessarily be, right? So a C4 cannot be organized primarily for influencing political campaigns. They can be organized primarily for lobbying. And so we just have to be able to get in our minds the difference between issue advocacy, lobbying, and campaigns. And this is very blurry for people, right? So if on the one side of the spectrum, 501c3 issue advocacy, right? C4 lobbying, PAC political campaigns. That's the way to think about it, right? And there's gray areas in between, but that's the safest way for you to operate as a C3, right? A PAC's chief purpose is to pool money, right? And contributors for a particular candidate or a political issue. So you can have state PACs. And this is really important because within the city, remember I mentioned the New York City's framework for campaign contributions, you can only make individual gifts, right? You can only make individual donations. But PACs are corporate entities. So PACs play very heavily at the state level and state assembly, state senate, particularly gubernatorial, right? And so they contribute extensively. And then I'm sure you've heard about series of cases which say that a corporation is a person and all of this stuff. It's for this reason. It allows them to make these donations to these entities, right? The other thing to be mindful of, if you enter into the world of the PACs, it has to be independent of a campaign. It can't just be an avenue of the campaign to spend money. So that it has to have, you have to prove that you're not really communicating with another candidate. That's why you'll see during, when you saw during the presidential election season, it'll say made by an independent expenditure committee or something like that. And we've even seen it. I live in Eastern Queens. We had a special election, and we actually had in our city council race an independent committee spend more than $200,000. It was pretty extensive. So you're going to find more of that happening in each of your local races as well. Next slide. Okay, so hot topics. This is pretty typical of what happens, right? Somebody running for office says, hey, can we grab some coffee? And how I advise folks is, and this usually happens to your executive director, but it often happens to lots of people, who are in the position of either being an advocate or, the in-house lobbyist or whatever the title is. And that's because the campaigns want to have access to you either for your subject matter expertise, or they want your Rolodex, right? Can you raise money for me? And all of these kinds of things. And what I say is, yes, go grab coffee with these folks. Just tell them, and I have like a standard statement that I guide everyone. It's like, as you're sitting down, just say, hey, just making sure I'm here just as a resident of the 23rd district, right? Or I'm here just in my position as as a mom, right? Or whatever it is, right? Just so you distinguish that conversation from something else. So yes, you can talk to folks if they reach out to you. And so that happens a lot. It's allowable. Just be mindful that you're letting them know in what capacity that you're talking to them about. The other thing is, can you do a little fundraiser for me? This happens a lot. As I mentioned, this is allowable so long as you are doing it in your private capacity. And I think you have to be very clear with your employees. And I'll talk about the employee handbook a little bit later. But people have a First Amendment right to conduct their own lives outside of work, as long as they're not intentionally confusing people about which capacity that they're acting in, right? So you can do a little fundraiser for someone, but just be mindful, under New York City campaign finance rules, the onus is on the campaign to fill out a form called the bundler's form. I call it a bundler's form, but it's an in-kind contribution. So here's an example. In days when you could actually go to somebody's house, say I'm the executive director of a nonprofit, a candidate says, can you do a little fundraiser for me? I go, do all the right things. I use my personal account, email account. I send out an invitation using my personal email. I say, come to my apartment. It's the campaign then that has to identify me as its in-kind contribution of the space and the coffee and the beer or whatever it is. So just there are other rules that surround doing a little fundraiser, but it is allowable so long as you're doing it in your personal capacity, right? Can you do a fundraiser for me? Same thing, right? I think as long as you're acting in your own capacity, I think you can, as long as you draw those lines very, draw that line very brightly. This happens mostly, right, with your board members. And so what the assumption is this, and this is the kind of things to look out for. When somebody reaches out to you, say, hey, can you do a little fundraiser for me? And you're you're a senior person at a nonprofit, they're assuming that you're going to invite all your board members, right? And so you really have to check with them and really, as you're cultivating your board, this is another thing to think about, is to let your board know, and you have to understand your board. You have to know who's comfortable doing this and who isn't, right? And so that's work that you do long before political season. So next slide. Okay, here's some best practices. So what I always recommend is to have a clear policy in your employee handbook in how to handle campaign season. So the basic stuff that you have to include, And I would have a page that every employee, the minute that they're hired, they sign off on, is something that says you will not use company resources for campaigns. Because you don't want someone, even if you are as meticulous as possible, you don't want that employee at some like remote site that that has very little connection to the C-suite of your nonprofit to do stuff and then be like, well, I didn't know. And then the implications come back to, the central office. So just have a clear policy. And then what I would do is redistribute a copy of this during election season. It's important to know when to do this. And this is what I mean by the third bullet, which is the political calendar. We really have to have an understanding that you have to know when people running for office are doing certain things. So it's good to know when petitioning, right? So, you guys have seen this. This is that long sheet. It's usually green. For Democrats, it's pink or red. For Republicans, I think it's pink. And they go around trying to get signatures. Like, you have to know why people are calling, right? And so if you see an employee of yours with these green sheets and they're, fiddling with them at the desk, you just have to be aware of what's going on, and you have to be able to correct that immediately. So it's good to know when the political calendar is, and also the fundraising calendar, right? And that's what I mean by both. You are likely to get calls around the last day of when donations are supposed to be counted for the next campaign finance filing, right? So I think that's really important. The other thing is to map who is running for what position. So if you have a catchment area of 3 neighborhoods, and those are your neighborhoods, know who's running, because the likelihood is if you're a prominent CBO, those folks are going to come after you or your employees to do something, right? So it's better to know, when somebody calls and say, hey, I'm doing this event, it's really about, Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And when you show up there and you realize, oh, that person called me because they're running for office and I didn't even know. And this happens all the time. And so it's just doing your homework on people before they get to you is really important. The other thing, and this everybody knows, don't use your email or work phone for anything other than work. And the reason I mention this is I've run into a lot of folks who are in the advocacy world who have multiple hats. And what I mean is I know folks who are the primary in-house lobbyists for a nonprofit. They're also senior positions in political parties, right? They are either, say a Democratic district leader, or they are on the board at Working Families Party or something like this. And so to be able to distinguish between the various hats that people wear, this is the easiest way. So, and then we'll just jump to the next slide. The other thing is really about social media, and I just wanted to bring this up and talk about it last, because it really is, it's important to just keep this in mind. It's so easy for our in-house communication team to be able to just, tag things that people say, right? So I'll give you a good example, and we just have to be mindful of who's doing what, right? So there's a candidate for mayor, and he is very smart, and he is deep into policy, and his tweets are like gold, I would say, for almost any service provider. Like, his tweets are like, we need to stop. I'm just picking maternal mortality, right? It's a very narrow issue, but there are a lot of people who work on this, and they love his tweets because it really amplifies very narrow issues. It shows that he has a deep understanding. But when you try and retweet stuff from a campaign, there could be a real question about your, and this goes back to that slide 4, right? It's a public statement of positions. And so either, you're just saying, well, I'm just repeating what he said, but is it really then maybe tacitly giving him your endorsement? So just be really mindful, right, of what you're tweeting, what you're tagging, and all of these kinds of things. I would, it gets even more complicated when the candidate is also a current elected official. And we see this often, right? There are city council members who want to be borough presidents. There are borough presidents who want to be mayors, and all of these kinds of things. So it's just, if you are invited, right? I mentioned you can go to an event and they can come to yours, and they're in their official capacity. Just tag them on their official, platform. So you're tagging, the borough president as opposed to candidate so and so, right? So I'm just going to end here, and then we can kind of transition to the next part. But I do, I'll keep an eye out for all these questions, and I will, answer them in the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. So we actually have a short quiz, just 6 questions to review some of the material that John presented. You can go to this website, slido.com. You can do it on your phone or on your computer. And you put in the code 77085, and you'll see that there is a quiz up there. There's a 40-second timer on each question as well.
This is like the pop quiz no one was prepared for. They're like, I
was
didn't
gonna
sign
say,
up
I
for
might get
this.
some of these wrong.
It's a helpful review because John did cover a lot of material, and I tried to pick 6 topics that would be relevant to nonprofits. So I'm just going to give everyone another minute to log on. I'll let you know when we're going to get started. Okay, and I'm going to go activate the first question. Okay, so it looks like everyone got this one right, which is great. It's important to remember, though, that if you are volunteering for or supporting a campaign in your free time, also to make a clear distinction that between your personal and professional efforts. So there is a leaderboard. It is based on how quickly you answer the questions as well. Okay, and moving on to the next one. Okay, so it looks like this one's a little trickier. You can reply to a candidate if they share your event. It's just important to remember not to reply saying anything that rates or endorses the candidate, even if the rating is objective. Okay, and next question is up. Okay, so this one is actually true. It is, you have the discretion as a nonprofit organization to set your own criteria for inviting candidates to your forum. So these things, polling, fundraising, and endorsements, they can help estimate the likelihood of a candidate getting a certain percentage of the vote. So that's helpful for determining which criteria you want to use to invite candidates to a forum in a field where there are a lot of candidates and you want to eliminate some. Okay, and the next question is up. So this one is true. It is in violation of IRS code. And the reason for that is that for this activity in particular, for activities that that can show evidence of bias in voter education or registration activities, so for those, you do want to contact other candidates before having one candidate join those activities. Right. So for other activities where that bias wouldn't be evident, sure. So the previous question, question 3. So to clarify for question 4, sorry, by not contacting other candidates for the same office, this can have the effect of favoring one candidate over the others, while candidates are free to volunteer in other ways. Evidence of bias in voter education and registration activities in particular constitutes prohibited participation. Okay, and move on to the next question. So this one is true. Nonprofit organizations can continue advocating for issues during a political campaign, but they must not use advocacy as an excuse or to double as political campaign intervention, which is what's presented in this case. So what we can do is review the 2 questions during the Q&A. Okay, and this is the last one. Okay, everyone got this one correct. It is false. It's not in violation of IRS code because there's the candidate is appearing in a role other than candidate, and there's no campaign activity occurring during the candidate's presence at the gala that's on violation of IRS code. So that was the last question. You can see the leaderboard. We have Laith in first place, Dawn in second place, Tiana in third place, Howard in fourth place, and Saba in fifth place. So thank you for everyone for participating. Gonna move on now to Louisa's presentation.
I think, John, you were going to answer the questions 3 and 4, maybe?
Yeah, so Louisa, I thought it would be good to do your presentation on forums versus voter get out the vote, because 3 and 4 really hinged on the type of activity it was. And I think that was a distinction. So I think people will have more clarity after hearing from you about those kinds of activity. And then I'll wrap it up in the questions. I think that the way the question is written, it was about forums and then a voter registration drive. So if we could do that, I think that might be useful to people.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name, as introduced at the beginning, is Louisa Hackett, and I started Community Votes 7 years ago to help community organizations integrate nonpartisan voter engagement work into their programs. I have actually worked in the nonprofit sector for my entire career. I too started at Victim Services Agency, which now is called Safe Horizon. And I got into this work because I realized in so many of the organizations I was working with that do strategic planning, they are having a terrible time trying to figure out how to address community needs, while at the same time they're working in neighborhoods that had very low voter turnout. And I really wondered how the work and mission of the organizations might be changed and be more effective if their communities voted and politicians paid attention to the issues the communities care about. And I, at the same time, learned about an organization called Nonprofit Vote, which has been supporting this work nationally. And I thought that was a terrific idea, but I also knew, because of my management consulting work at Community Resource Exchange, how hard it could be to simply integrate additional work into what groups were already doing. So I did a small pilot project with 3 community groups. I trained a cohort of people on staff, and they registered voters in a nonpartisan way. They educated voters in a nonpartisan way, and they encouraged people to vote, again, in a nonpartisan way. And we were able to show that the voters that these nonprofits contacted actually turned out to vote at higher rates than the rest of the neighborhood. So I thought, okay, good to go. Let's start this project. So before I preview the contents of the toolkit, I want to share why nonprofits and the groups we've been working with have been successful in getting people out to vote. And it's the main reason is they actually rely on voter research. They've been guided by that. And the research says that the most effective voter mobilization strategy is a one-on-one conversation with a trusted person. So it's not a TV ad, it's not a mailer, it's just old-fashioned talking. And as we all know, nonprofits talk to lots of people all day long, and they are trusted. So in short, nonprofits are trusted messengers. The second proven voter mobilization strategy from research is providing nonpartisan information, basic information about when the election is, when the deadlines are to register to vote, when the deadlines are to ask for a vote by mail application, who's running for office, and where to go vote. And this is all good news because, as John pointed out in the first part of this session, 501c3 nonprofits need to be nonpartisan. So it's nice to know that for nonprofits to be successful, voter research says we're supposed to be nonpartisan. So that works with the IRS also. So we can't tell anybody who to vote for, but we can share basic information about elections and voting, and we can be very partisan about the importance of voting. So next slide, please. So it's good news to know that serving as a hub of election information is an allowable activity because as long as that information is nonpartisan. Nonprofits here and in New York City and across the country have figured out ways to use their existing activities to promote voting. I'm going to share now some examples of activities that nonprofits have done in COVID times, and in hopes that maybe by the time of the November election, most people will be vaccinated, and maybe we can do more in-person, sort of that old-fashioned voter outreach. But in COVID time, what organizations have done is they've used staff meetings and program orientations to include public service announcements about deadlines to register to vote. They've also used their communication platforms, emails, social media, and websites to provide links to where people can get voter registration forms and information about candidates. They've also recruited volunteers to join existing Get Out the Vote phone banks or text banking operations. Again, those are run by groups doing it in a nonpartisan manner. Also, organizations, if they're running an emergency food distribution site, they've had people on site there to give people forms, voter registration forms to fill out should they want to do that. And a final activity groups have done is they've held sort of virtual parties. And in these virtual parties, they will have people make sure that they know the rules and requirements about voter registration. They will send links to people so they can complete their voter registration form. And then they'll ask their friends and family to do the same. So those are examples of what some groups have done in the time of social distancing and having to wear masks. Prior to COVID, what some nonprofits have done is they've trained receptionists. So while people are in waiting rooms, waiting to go to meetings, they can ask people if they'd be interested in registering to vote. They've had competitions among departments to try to get 100% of the eligible staff registered to vote. Here again, to be nonpartisan, everybody wins, because you don't want to in any way incentivize one department winning over another, because you don't want to be seen as you're sort of paying or encouraging paying for registration. I'm not sure I'm being as clear as I can be. It's you can't incentivize people to register to vote. So if you decide to do a voter registration drive within your organization, you can throw a voter registration celebration party to celebrate everybody, but you can't give one department cupcakes for getting more people registered to vote than others. Other organizations have trained their seniors in their senior center, and they've held voter registration drives at community picnics and outside of organizations. So those are just sort of some examples of what organizations have done sort of in COVID and pre-COVID times. Next slide. So I wanted to share a little bit about what's in the toolkit, and it's really designed to help people in New York State get people registered to vote and out to vote on election day. It has a range of resources in there. So for example, if you think some people in your organization may be concerned that nonprofits aren't allowed to talk about elections, and they weren't able to come today to learn and hear from John about what is allowable, the kit includes checklists and FAQs and do's and don'ts that can be used to share with leadership in the organization to calm fears, to let people know that it is okay for nonprofits to do this work, again, as long as they do it in a nonpartisan manner. If you think your organization would like to use its communication platforms, like its website or social media accounts, or the email addresses of staff and program participants. It includes sample emails leadership can send out to remind people about deadlines. It includes social media graphics that can be used. And it also includes an election timeline so people can understand when all those deadline dates are. And finally, if you think voter registration would be of great interest to your organization, and you really want to do sort of a more comprehensive get out the vote effort, the toolkit includes a planning guide to help you figure out how to get buy-in from leadership, to identify what I call sort of the political nerds on staff that would like to sort of join a committee to sort of think through and develop a voter registration drive. It also includes sort of ideas and examples of what other organizations have done. So next slide. So it has 4 sections. The first one is what we call nonprofit, nonpartisan power. That's all the information about what we are allowed to do as not-for-profits. The second one is the specific New York State voter rules and regulations about who's eligible to register to vote and what those deadlines are. And the third section includes specific information about the New York State elections, including an FAQ about ranked choice voting, because that's going to be used for the first time in the city for the primary election. Ahmed, if you could now share the link to the toolkit, just so you can see how it's sort of structured.
It's in the chat now.
Okay. So if people open that link, you can see that each section of the toolkit is designed to be as easy to access as possible, so you can download one item at a time. It also includes a training guide, a PowerPoint training guide that before I show you the specifics of that, I too want to do a little pop quiz. We're not going to do it in Slido, but I have found that many organizations don't sort of understand sort of basic information about elections in New York. So I wanted to sort of test your knowledge about this. So the first question is, and you can either raise your hand or put it in chat. For the 2020 general election, the one we just had, what percentage of eligible New York State voters do you all think turned out? So you can, so we got 36%, Lisa says. This is for the general election. Any other guesses? Higher, 52, says Michelle, 60, Alana. Alana, you're closest so far. It was 63% in New York State. Now, the next question is, how about for the midterm election in 2018? What percentage of eligible voters do you all think turned out for the midterm election? Michelle says 35. Beta says 60. Alana says 30. Tiana says 50. Tiana's the closest. It was 45%. Okay, so the presidential election was 63, midterm was 45. So now let's turn our attention to New York City. So the last local election was in 2017. What percentage of eligible New York City voters turned out for the last local or mayoral election? 33, 47, 35. Guys, it's lower. Okay, there we go. You won. Is it late? It was 22%. 22%. Okay, last question. We're going back to the New York City primary. It's what percentage, it says New York State, but it's it should be the New York City. So for in the primary election in 2020, what percentage of New York City voters turned out? Any guesses? 17, close. It was 13%. 13%. So if you could go to the next slide, one of the reasons we share this information, and this is a slide that's in the training deck, is there is, and correctly so, an effort to register voters, because as you can see in New York State, 30% of eligible voters aren't registered to vote. So it's important to register voters. But if you could go to the next slide, Ahmed. But it's also really, really important to get those people that are already registered actually out to vote. So we really have a terrible voter turnout problem. And as you can see, it's almost sort of ironic because New York is not a swing state, but even though we're not a swing state, and in the general election, because so much attention is paid to it, many more people vote in those elections than they do in the midterm elections or in local elections. And when you're looking at a New York City primary election in which I think it's 75 or 78% of registered voters in the city are registered as Democrats, essentially the winner of the Democratic primary is going to win, most likely going to win the general election. So when only 13% of the people are voting in a primary, that means 13% of the people are essentially deciding who the winner is going to be. So I share this information as to encourage you and all your organizations, and even talking to all your friends, to talk about how important it will be to sort of turn out for the primary election. And the next slide. So John had mentioned understanding the elections timeline. This doesn't include sort of the filing deadlines for the candidates, but this does include all the deadlines for being able to register to vote in the primary, which is June 22nd, through lots of advocacy and efforts made. New York State updated some of the most antiquated voting regulations in the country, and now we have an early voting period, so people can vote in person beginning June 12th. And because of COVID, everyone now is eligible to be able to vote by mail, but they have to get in the request by June 15th. So there's a whole bunch of dates related to the June primary, and the whole thing happens again for the November election. And simply understanding this information and being able to let the staff of your organizations know, and the program participants of your organizations know, and the communities you serve know, is a great service. And when we talk about being a hub of election information, this is some of the information that we're talking about. Next slide. So I want to share a little sampling of the training deck. Those two inverted pyramids are examples of some of the information that are included in part one. This training is really designed, it can be delivered all at once, or each section can last between 30 and 45 minutes. And it's each in the PowerPoint, in the notes section are the facilitator's guides, so that it can be easy to use, so that you can deliver this training on your own. And if you could go to the next slide. It includes 2 series of social media graphics. As I pointed out on the election timeline, there's dates related to the primary and there's dates related to the general election. So there's graphics that can be used for both of those deadlines, and they can be used either as a single graphic to post or as an Instagram story. And those are all downloadable and can be used by your organizations. And they do include sort of where groups can find out if they're registered to vote. They can also go to websites to get registered to vote. And the last slide I wanted to share. Sorry, second to last slide. The designers who designed this, there's a different color scheme for the general election versus the primary election. Okay, then the last slide. I wanted to, for any of your organizations that are new to this work, I wanted to encourage you all to recognize and realize there's many potential partners and existing tools out there, that you will be joining a very active community of not-for-profit and do-good or good government organizations doing this work. I wanted to point out a new tool that's going to be released after the school holiday. That's on the bottom left. It's created by the Citizens Committee. No, it's not. I think I've got it's the group that does Gotham Gazette. Is that Citizens Committee? Apologies. The candidate guide by Elect NYC. I might have attributed it to the wrong organization who's doing it, but it is a guide where someone can put in their address and it will pull up all the different candidates that are running for city council and for mayor. It will include basic information about the person's bio. They hope to get information on every single candidate, but because there's over, I think, 400 candidates, what they decided to do is to prioritize those neighborhoods where the turnout is low and income is low. So they are slowly going to populate it to try to get as much as they can, but they're prioritizing those 2 neighborhoods first. And I share these other organizations because should you want to have training to train your community on how to do ranked choice voting, Rank the Vote NYC is last count I heard it hired 8 organizers that are available to come, I guess, probably virtually to do a training on how ranked choice voting works. Also, organizations such as Common Cause New York run nonpartisan phone banks and text banking. So if any of your organizations have people that want to get involved in getting out the vote, these organizations use volunteers and would be happy to get some interested volunteers. So that's just a brief little snapshot of the type of things that are in the toolkit. And I can, not sure if I did enough, John, to distinguish between your ability to answer those 2 questions, but.
We can answer them now, however.
So Howard's going to moderate. There's a bunch of questions that came in, so I also want to go in the order that people asked them, just so I know that we're a little bit tight on time. Howard, you there?
Hi everyone. Thank you for coming. I do, maybe we, just for the sake of flow, that we try to address that particular question, and then I can go in and ask a little bit more about some of the questions that came in both beforehand and others. So John, if you want to just
so the distinction I see Ahmed making between 3 and 4, right? The third question, number 3, is really about candidate forums, right? And so, and as I mentioned, say there are 10 candidates, you've set up some criteria in which you end up getting 6 or 7 that meet your criteria, and you treat them all equally by inviting them to a forum, right? So people are going to say, okay, you've set up some criteria, you've met your criteria. Now, say you have that criteria, but as you're doing voter outreach, you invite just one of them, right? The implication is that you haven't actually met your own criteria, and then you've cherry picked one of those 6 or 7 to do a voter registration drive with. And so it just looks bad, right? That it looks like somebody can make the case that you have or you have selected or you are endorsing that one particular person. So that's how I read the distinction between those questions. Ahmed is very tricky. He's as tricky as the IRS, so it's good.
Great. Did that answer? I know somebody was looking for clarifications. If you want to say in the chat if that clarified things or not. Okay. I'm going to assume if that people have that cleared it up. See, so there's some general questions. Maybe I'll save that for the end. I think one of the things that came up in the chat was does advocating on issues include supporting or opposing legislation? I'm guessing they're saying, or they're asking whether or not talking about legislation is prohibited or not.
So taking a stab at this, I think you can educate people about your issues that are important to you, right? The distinction is whether it falls within the lobbying laws or not, because so one, right, is if you're telling people this is bad, right? If you say we've done an analysis and we think more buses are better than fewer buses, right? So that's one thing. There's a second thing is if you then are saying we feel more buses are better, so please vote for X piece of legislation. That is lobbying, but it may not trigger all of the registration requirements. If, and again, that was really, I hate to refer back to our previous presentation a few weeks ago, but you can chime in on legislation. The question is how much time and how much energy you spend on a piece of legislation, right? And how much of your expenditures are on that piece of legislation. So that's important. Now,
sure,
the third thing here is if you know that there's a candidate who likes more buses and you say, hey, we support buses, so we support candidate Y, then that's impermissible under this thing. So there's a bunch of activity that and it depends on the context in which you are advocating for those. I hope that helps.
Okay. Let's see, looking at some of the other questions, I think one of them was already, I guess this was a really specific question. So let's say a candidate appears at a public event and is doing it in another capacity other than the candidate, other than being a candidate, and meets all the criteria and doesn't do any campaign activities, but wears like campaign related
this paraphernalia. I'm curious to see what a campaign mask is, so I'd love to see that picture just on my own. But to answer that question, I think the line that's crossed really is when the organization posts the pictures, right? So say you hold an event, you try and make it as nonpartisan as possible, multiple people show up, and then a campaign peels off and uses your event as a backdrop. And you have no control over that. And you could reasonably deny that you, right, organized this event for that purpose. But when you start posting those pictures, then it's harder to make that case, right? So what I would say is the candidate can post the pictures and tag the nonprofit, right? Because I know there are a lot of nonprofits now doing vaccine drives or testing drives or, absolutely necessary now, which is food banks and a lot of food work. There's a lot of food work that's going on, and candidates show up. they can post. They can say, "Oh, I love the work that so and so nonprofit is doing," but that's on them. As long as you're not the one doing it, I think you'll be okay.
And I think there's also some additional ones, specific cases about interacting with candidates. So this one is about co-authoring an article with a candidate, but not in, the candidate, not as a candidate, but as whatever community member or whatever.
That's allowable, because as long as you yourself as a nonprofit isn't, promoting it as a campaign tool, right? And so this happens all the time. This article thing is only one. So I know a very specific candidate who every Wednesday or Thursday has a public policy forum, and they organize it and they invite nonprofits to come to speak. And even that is allowable, right? One, the candidate is inviting you. Two, you are there as a subject matter expert, right? And you're not commenting about the campaign. It's just that the campaign is doing all the other work. You've just been invited to talk about your issue. So even that could work. So I put your joint public, joint authorship of an article to be fine.
Okay. And then finally, this one is kind of spins it the other way around. Can a candidate support a nonprofit using their own reach, right? So for example, they have a newsletter and it has some part of it. They say this organization is great, you should support it.
Yeah, I think that's fine, as long as you're not then saying, then retweeting that, right? If they put something out that says, please donate to the, Bensonhurst Food Bank. But if the Bensonhurst Food Bank says, hey, look at this great work that candidate Y is doing to support our food bank, then that gets more murky. So as long as that communication is one way and you're not, you're doing as little to coordinate with them as possible.
Okay. Let's see. So
there was some question I saw about organizational fundraiser. Like, I'm just looking.
Yeah, I think that was the one. That was the one that was a question that I was asking. So can a C3 ask a candidate to share their own organizational fundraiser to candidate networks? Is that coordination then?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about that question. Veda, what is that? Like, maybe you can chime in and clarify, because it's something that's, I think, maybe worth discussing.
Do we have to unmute her?
No, I'm here.
Okay.
Thanks. Actually, this is super helpful. Yeah, essentially, in lieu of a gala, we've been planning a virtual fundraiser, and we have a list of essentially like micro influencers, and some of those people are now running for, like, they have a candidacy this year. And so I guess I just wanted to know, should we avoid those people altogether? Or should we still reach out to them and say, hey, if you want to share our posts about donating to Sucky and supporting our org in some way, like, is that okay?
Yeah, I would say let them share your posts as opposed to you retweeting their posts about you. Does that make sense?
So like you said, one-way relationship, we can reach out to them and say, well, please support Sucky and please share our posts. We cannot, on the other hand, share whatever it is that they share about Sucky.
Yeah, I mean, reaching out to them just kind of is a gray area, right? So in the ideal world, it would be they stumble upon, right, your fundraiser, right? And then they themselves, but I know it's complicated because people, board members have various connections and all this other stuff, but it's better that way, right? That they learn about your fundraiser, and without you having to prompt them at all, right? As an organization, then they share or they tweet it out to their networks, and then you just leave it alone from that point.
Okay, that's helpful. We will probably avoid those folks. So thank you.
I'm going to jump ahead to a couple of questions for Louisa, just to make sure we get everybody all the different variety of questions. So there one, Louisa, going back to those percentages that you shared, the does eligible mean just those who were registered to vote at the time, or does it include those who could have been registered but were not?
It includes everybody that was eligible.
So everybody that was a citizen in 18 years and older.
Mhm.
Okay. And then another one is, do you know of any of these, or if any of the organizations that you shared resources about have linguistically diverse resources? I think the individual is asking for South Asian languages in particular.
Yes, that's a good question. It depends on the organization. I know Rank the Vote NYC that's doing the trainings. They are getting their training materials translated into multiple languages, including Asian languages. So, but and the website that Elect NYC, I know they're trying to raise some money to get it translated, but at this point it's just in English, but they hope to be able to get it into more languages beyond just English.
I've seen a lot of the election related materials in Bangla and in Punjabi, if you're interested in South Asian languages, but other languages, South Asian languages are harder to find, but those two are out there.
And then I think a final question for Louisa. So if somebody turns 18 after June 15th, they can't vote in the primary, is that correct?
No,
Yeah.
they can register and they can vote. They need to be 18 the day of the election.
Okay, but you can register before.
Yeah, and they can register before. It's a good question. Not sure if they could vote early. Maybe not. Maybe they'd have to vote on election day. John, do you know?
Yeah, I mean, the way I would have handled, I as a problem solving thing, if I were the 18-year-old who was unable to register, right, because of the deadline was before, I would show up and fill out on the day of, fill out an affidavit saying, I know that I am eligible to vote. I am, 18 and I am eligible to vote, and go from there. That might be the practical point.
Well, except for they need to register to vote 25 days before the election. So they should fill out the voter registration form 25 days before the election. And then they can go, and if they don't appear on the voter rolls, then do as John said.
Right.
Okay. All right. Let's see. I got another interesting question here, and I think this is something that all of us have faced. Can a candidate invite themselves to an organizational meeting or event to share their views as they relate to the organization's mission? Does the organization have to invite all candidates running for the same office to the event if that particular candidate invites themselves?
Yeah, this is a tough one because I'm trying to think, now in the world of COVID, it's not as though somebody could just, drop in on an event, because I've seen this happen in the past when it's physical, right? You don't expect this person and they've heard about this event. They show up and they stand on the dais and, but if you quote unquote are ambushed, I think there's a, again, you could easily explain to someone, if you ever called on it, to say, listen, this person showed up and they came to the mic and they said what they needed to say. We explicitly told them this is not a campaign event and we can't endorse anyone. And the way I would handle this is say, look, say you're at a public function, say you're out in the park, it's a park cleanup day, and then you have a dais set up and then everybody talks at the end and this person comes in, and you can just, right after the person speaks, you can just say, again, pointing out that we're a nonprofit, we are not endorsing any candidate. As long as you take those precautions, because this happens all the time, pre-COVID, right? People just show up to things and like to speak, and it's understood that they're not there at the, at the invitation of the organizer.
What if we know ahead of time that they give us warnings, so it's not quite an ambush? Do we have to make a good faith effort to invite all the other candidates to try to head that off, or does that?
Yeah, the way I would handle it is this, which is for every campaign have a generic email, right? And just send it to that generic email just to cover yourself. Whether those people ever open that generic info at, johnalbertformayor.org thing, that's another story. Or whether they open it up, that email 6 days later, making it not relevant, at least you've covered yourself, right?
Okay.
And that's, a lot of this is how to protect yourself from liability in the future. And that's how I would think about it.
Okay. I think I'm going to make a last call for questions. Just go ahead and put them in the chat. Or maybe I'll take, I had some prepared questions for how were you doing on time, Ahmed?
We're actually a little bit over.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, seeing as there's no other questions, I want to thank both of our panelists, John Albert and Louisa Hackett, for their time, and also thank everybody else for coming out to this training session. And hopefully I think there was a survey in the chat. I hope that people will fill it out and give us some feedback about that. Anything else that you wanted to cover before we close out?
Yeah, so there's actually an event next Tuesday at 7 p.m. The Year of Asian Hate. Where do we go from here? So this is an event where you can hear about why anti-Asian violence is happening, what we can do to address it. So I encourage everyone to attend.
Is this an event that we are hosting? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, it's
All
on the
right.
screen. So I can actually share the link with everyone who attended.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Oh, with the immigrants. Okay, great.
Right. I'll
all
share the
right then.
presentation as well.
Sure. Great. Thank you again for everybody for attending. I'm looking forward to the feedback for this session, and thanks again, and have a good day, everybody.